Okay, so we have Parshas Chayei Sarah, and does everyone have a copy? Yeah, they went around. So this week's Torah portion starts out. It says, "Vayiyu Chayei Sarah," and the life of Sarah was Mea Shana Esrim Shana v'Sheva Shanim, 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, i.e., she lived 127 years. Shnei Chayei Sarah, these are the years of the life of Sarah. So there are a lot of commentaries about the way this is worded. First of all, why would you say 100 years and 20 years and 7 years? It's a much more standard, common approach to say 127 years. It also repeats at the end, Shnei Chayei Sarah, these are the years of the life of Sarah, when we already know that because it says, Vayiyu Chayei Sarah, and the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. Why do we need to repeat at the end and say these were the years of the life of Sarah? So there's a medrash that sort of putting this all together. It says a number of different things, a number of different lessons that we learn. One of them is, we'll read from the opening paragraph. So al pasuk vayiyu chayei Sarah, maybe a medrash. The medrash brings as a pasuk. It quotes another pasuk. Yudea Hashem yemei tamimim. Hashem knows the days of the complete. Umefarish, and it explains kashem shehem tamimim, just as they righteous people are complete. Kach shnoisam tamimim, so too are their years complete. Or maybe dugman lekach misara, and then the medrash goes on to bring an example of this. An example to illustrate this from Sarah, sheshnoiseha hayot tamimos, that her years were complete. Shelo nirgam umamish mehashanim sheniktzavulot, that whatever the years, the amount of time that had been allotted and attributed to her to live her life, it all played out completely. Nothing changed. Her life wasn't shortened at all for any reason. And so this is one of the reasons why the pasuk's so repetitive and worded a little differently to teach us. It's an emphasis on the years. The years were complete. The years were exactly the way they were supposed to be. They were exactly the way they were planned to be. Now, a number of things about this. And I wouldn't say, again, these are not questions that pose a challenge or a difficulty that we need to resolve per se. But there's room here to clarify, because if the Torah is choosing specifically, Sarah's not the only righteous person in our history, right? We have many, many, many righteous people that we learn about in Torah. Sarah's not the only person about whom or for whom Hashem made sure her years were complete, because she was complete as a person. She lived a complete life. So why does the Torah choose specifically Sarah to teach us this lesson about? Now, the reason a medrash says it about Sarah makes sense, because the psukim, the way the psukim are worded, is in such a way that it seems to be teaching us something, and this is a lesson that it is teaching us. So the question is not why did the medrash choose to tell us it about Sarah. The medrash is just extracting or unpacking, elaborating a lesson that is taught to us in the pasuk. Why does the pasuk, the Torah, choose to teach us this about Sarah as opposed to any of the other numerous righteous people about whom this phenomenon was true, that Hashem, made sure they lived their lives to the fullest? One of the explanations that's given for this is the fact that the Midrash also tells us that Sarah passed away abruptly, right? And we had at the end of last week's Parsha, where does last week's Parsha end up? What does it end up with? It ends up with the story of the Akedah of Yitzchak supposedly being taken to be sacrificed, even though that was never actually the plan. It doesn't actually, Hashem never instructed Abraham to sacrifice Yitzchak. He said to bring him up as a offering of ascent, which generally would be understood as a burnt offering, because that's usually what it means. But anyways, that's a tangent. So the last week's Parsha finishes up with us being told the story of Avram taking Yitzchak with the understanding that he was going to be literally sacrificing him on an altar. And then immediately following that, this week's Parsha, this week's Torah portion opens up with a story, or telling us about the passing of Sarah. And so the Midrash tells us that the reason it's in this order, the quote-unquote sacrificing of Yitzchak followed immediately by the passing of Sarah is because Sarah actually passed away as an outcome of this story. Sarah got this message that Avraham Avinu took your son, this son who you waited almost a century to have, and that was born miraculously, and etc., etc. And Avraham Avinu is taking him and is just going to go, kill him and offer him as a sacrifice. And she freaked out and her soul left her body, and that's how she passed away. So it would make sense then, perhaps, that the Torah wants to specifically point out to us that you might think that this story came along, she passed away abruptly. Abruptly, we could then perhaps re-describe or re-articulate as unexpectedly. If it's unexpectedly, maybe she didn't end up living out all the years she was destined to live. So the Torah tells us, no, she actually did. She was a complete person. She lived a complete life, and Hashem made sure that her years were complete. So even though, based on the story or based on this fact that she passed away abruptly as a result of hearing about the passing of Yitzchak, we might suspect or consider the possibility that she died unexpectedly. So specifically about her, the Midrash, the Torah is telling us, no, this was exactly when she was supposed to pass away. This was the plan. This was the schedule, etc. Which is a reasonable explanation as to why the Torah tells us this lesson specifically about her. But there's got to be more than that, right? Everything that happens in Torah is so precise and so intentional, so many layers deep, that at least, let's say, it's fair to expect that there is a very, very profound, fundamental connection between Sarah specifically and this idea of the years being complete, which is why the Torah chooses to teach us this lesson specifically about Sarah rather than about any of the other people about whom we know this to be true. Or maybe some whom we don't know specifically, explicitly, but there certainly are others. So there's going to be something about Sarah specifically that makes her the person about whom Hashem wanted to teach us this lesson. So we're going to dig in and really break things down. And at the end of all of the conversation, we're going to understand why very clearly. It's going to make a lot of sense why specifically Sarah. And the idea about, the story of Yitzchak and her passing away abruptly, and the possibility of misunderstanding abruptly as being unexpectedly, whilst it's valid and it's true, it's, at the risk of maybe not using the perfect word, almost a little superficial or tangential relative to the way that we're going to explain it as being a fundamental, something that's fundamental to who Sarah was. And part of the beauty in this is that we're going to see the idea shared across both Avram and Sarah as a couple, as the parents of the Jewish people, the original, the first forefather and foremother of the Jewish people, for as in F-O-R-E, not F-O-U-R, because we have the forefathers. There were four mothers, but three fathers, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, so F-O-R-E, the forefathers. Avram and Sarah were the original. Yes, Yitzchak and Rivka were also parents of the Jewish people, but Avram and Sarah were the first original patriarch and matriarch of the entire Jewish people. And this idea, the idea which is going to be at the basis and foundation of understanding why the Torah teaches us this lesson specifically in the context of Sarah, is actually something that we see, and we can talk about it at a number of levels, is really a common theme that was true of Avram and Sarah, each individually and together as a team. Because ultimately that's what they were. They were a team. So we have about Sarah this statement in the Medrash that says that just like the Torah tells us about Sarah, teaches us a lesson in the context of Sarah, that about the righteous, just like they are complete, so too their days are complete. We have a statement about Avram Avinu in the Medrash that's not exactly the same, but a bit similar thematically, and we're going to break them down and talk about them. So about Avram Avinu, the pasuk says, "Va'avram zokein bar bayomim." Avram was old, bar bayomim, coming of days. And so the Midrash says, why does it say twice? It seems to be repetitive, and it's not exactly the same words, but it's the same idea. Presumably, coming of days means old. So the Midrash says you have some people who are zokein, some people who are zokein and not bar bayomim, some people are old but not coming of days, some people are coming of days but not old. And Avram Avinu was both. So the Torah wants to let us know he had both of these attributes. Now, very sort of at the level of pshat, the simple face value meaning, the difference between zokein and bar bayomim, zokein means old or elderly, which would mean old in character, in appearance, etc. Bar bayomim means coming of days, i.e. actual chronological age. Right? What's everybody's favorite compliment to, someone who's middle age plus? Both to give and to receive, maybe more to receive than to give. Wow, no way you're that old. You look so young for your age. Right? The way that a person presents and appears and come across would be zokein. Some people come across as older, some people come across as younger. And then there's bar bayomim, coming of days, the actual chronological age of the number of days they've been alive. And we have specific stories. The story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who, was 18 years old, and because he was elected and supposed to be, he was just such an incredible, unusual person that he was actually elected and appointed to be the leader of all the sages of his generation at the age of 18. And there were sages who had been learning Torah more or less 24/7 minus the time it took to eat a little, sleep a little, etc. for decades, and he was only 18 years old. And he had this problem that, he's supposed to be the leader of all the sages. He's this little kid. It's going to be hard for people to respect him and look up to him. And Hashem made a miracle that overnight he aged and looked like he was 70 years old. Right? So he was zokein, he was an elderly person, but he wasn't bar bayomim. He had only been alive for 18 years. So that's the simple sort of face value meaning. Obviously, there's more to it than that, because it's not like the Torah is going to tell us, well, some people are actually have been alive for a long time, but they don't come across as elderly, and the Torah wants to make sure we know that not only had Avram been alive for a long time, he also came across as elderly. There's going to be something else that the Torah is telling us here, other than make sure you don't make the mistake of thinking that Avram was only chronologically old, but he didn't come across as elderly. That's not something, presumably, that the Torah would feel the need to point down and emphasize. Some people are only old in age, but he was also came across as elderly. So if we look at the words zokein and bar bayomim, the terms, right, zokein means old, but the word zokein is also used to allude to, right, zokein has some degree of resemblance to an abbreviation of zeh shekana chachma, one who has acquired wisdom. Right, there's a reason why it's relatively common for people to seek advice from those who are older than them. It's not because advanced age, having been alive for a longer time, intrinsically makes one more appropriate to seek advice from. It's that if you want advice, it's a good idea to seek advice from someone who's going to have wisdom to impart and is going to be a likely source of good advice. And the bottom line is, the longer someone's been around, the more time they've had to accumulate knowledge and experience and nuance and sensitivities, etc. So it's reasonable that there is going to be, and there is a correlation between having been alive for a longer period of time and having a greater degree of wisdom, right? And I say correlation because obviously it's not either or. There are some young people who are, there are people who are younger and just gifted and intuitive and just have a gift of wisdom and can be extraordinarily wise. And there are some older people who you wouldn't want to get advice from. But there's a correlation. Yeah.
So is that also like the way of saying that Avram was also complete in his years?
We're going to get to it. Let's break it down. So Zaken, old, can also mean one who has acquired wisdom, one who is wise. Okay, so now it's starting to make a little bit more sense that the Medrash is going to impart to us that he was someone who had acquired wisdom. Some people are only coming of days, they're actually elderly chronologically, but they're not wise. And some people are wise, but they're not actually advanced of age chronologically, so he was both. Okay. We can look at Bar Bayomim, right? It doesn't say he had lived many years. It says Bar Bayomim, coming of days, which also can and does refer to something that's, more sort of equivalent and in the same genre as the way that we're now understanding and interpreting Zaken, as not someone who presents as old, but someone who is wise, which correlates with being older. Right? Why did it say Bar Bayomim? Now, technically speaking, the truth is, if we look at the words Bar Bayomim, which I think probably I would guess, I haven't actually looked, but my guess is most translations probably say something along the lines of coming of days. It doesn't say coming of days. Ba means come. Sorry. Yomim means days. What does base mean as a prefix? In. Ba Bayomim, coming in days. Now, yes, it can be loosely translated and often is, but we could actually look at Ba'in as that we can look at it here. We could translate it literally and see how that's actually really the message. And when we translate Ba Bayomim with the base literally coming in days, coming into the days, it's actually going to make a lot more sense that the Torah is emphasizing these two things rather than he was both chronologically old and presented as old. That seems like a very strange thing that the Torah wants to emphasize. We're going to translate this literally, and then the Zaken as wise, one who has acquired wisdom, and it's going to make a lot more sense that the Torah is emphasizing both parts here. So, Zaken and Bar Bayomim are two different, let's say, qualities. And the Torah is emphasizing both of these virtuous qualities or achievements. So Zaken, Zeshe Kana Chochma, one who has acquired wisdom, and obviously it refers to divine wisdom, Torah. Generally speaking, right, we have many, many phrases and expressions in Mamar Chazal, etc., that refer to Torah and mitzvahs. Right, we talk about it's a very common thing, Torah and mitzvahs, Torah and mitzvahs. So there's the learning of Torah and then there's the observance of mitzvahs. Now, it is a mitzvah to learn Torah. So technically it could just say mitzvahs, which includes learning Torah, because learning Torah is a mitzvah. So clearly there's something unique, something fundamental that's different about Torah that's not just a mitzvah. When we learn Torah, what we are achieving is not just the fact that we're observing the mitzvah of learning Torah, which is the same as observing any other mitzvah. Because if that was the extent of the value of learning Torah, the fact that it's a mitzvah, the expression would just be mitzvahs. There would be no expression Torah and mitzvahs. There's obviously something else about Torah in addition to the fact that it's a mitzvah. And if we look at what happens when a person learns Torah, it's something very unique. And it's actually incredible. I'm just thinking about how much of a tangent it's not really a tangent, how much in depth we can go. Let's try and do this. I'll try to keep it brief. Is anyone familiar with the term neuroplasticity? right? It's become somewhat in vogue recently. So neuroplasticity means growth. Plastic means something that grows anatomically, physiologically. Neuroplasticity means the fact that neurons, nerve cells, have the ability to grow and develop. Which is a big part of, let's say, advanced learning. Why is it, for example, that a newborn baby, generally speaking, a newborn baby is capable of crying, eating, and dirtying their diaper? Right? A really newborn baby, if you look at a newborn baby the day they're born and pay attention and observe, you can really wonder, like, how much is this baby aware of? Like, does the baby even realize that it exists? You look in their eyes, they don't seem to have much awareness or understanding at all. You look at a baby that's 2-3 months old, it's a different world. They're aware, they're paying attention, they're processing, they're taking things in. Also, let's say a baby that's newborn, they don't have control. They can't move their hands intentionally. They don't have control of their bodies at all, other than the ability to eat and the ability to get rid of waste. And then, this takes more time, more months, probably, more than a half a year, I think. Eventually, over time, they could start to reach out. And you watch, right? You watch your baby, and it's a fascinating thing when they're, I don't know what it is, 7, 8, 9 months, whatever it is, thereabouts, I think. You'll see them try to reach out for something, and they try to reach out, and the thing that they want is over here, and they, end up over there somewhere, and they keep trying, and eventually they get it. It might take days of trying. It might just take a few tries. Why is it that a newborn baby can't see something, decide that they want it, and reach out for it, but when they're closer to a year old, they can? I mean, there's a lot going on, but a big part of that is that their brain doesn't actually have the physical capacity to communicate that message, to process and communicate the message. And it takes time for the brain to actually develop, for the nerve cells in the brain to develop and grow branches. They're called dendrites. Each of the nerve cells in the brain has lots of different branches. If you zoom in at very high resolution, it just looks like this big 3-dimensional mesh. And what it is a bunch of cells, and each cell has branches going out in all directions, and the branches of one cell will connect to all the branches of different surrounding cells, which then allows for the communication and flow of information, of processing of instructions, etc. And it takes time for those branches to develop and to meet each other and to interact, and then to start forming a pathway to transmit and communicate. So the brain doesn't actually have the hardware to send the message across through the brain and then down to the hand isn't in place yet. It takes time for that to develop and physically grow. That's neuroplasticity. It's nerve cells growing. So, and it's, if you look at the life, the activity of a baby, of a newborn baby, what do? They spend, whatever it is, an hour or two, maybe a bit more, depending on how smoothly things go, eating every day. They spend a couple hours awake. And if things are going the way they should be, a newborn baby could be sleeping 18, 20 hours a day. And if you look at the volume, the mass of food that a newborn baby eats, not just a newborn baby and infant, even toddlers, but especially newborn babies and infants, if you actually measure how much they eat, if they're eating properly, eating well and healthily, the number of calories that they take in relative to their body weight is enormous for such a tiny little thing. If you would take the body weight of an adult, any adult, divide it by the body weight of an infant or a newborn, and then multiply the number of calories and nutrients that the newborn or infant eats, and multiply that by the ratio to the adult's weight, we'd be eating a lot more than we do. So it's a few things, yes. So, right, so first of all, that's a big part of it. The baby's growing at a very high rate. So if the baby's getting bigger, where does that new mass come from? It comes from the food they eat. in addition to the fact that they need a lot of new mass just to literally build new tissue out of, they need a lot of food, they are burning an extraordinary number of calories relative to their size. Number one, in the growth process. And number two, in the neuroplasticity, their brain, the rate at which their brain is learning relative to what they are, right? The brain has to create new, and it's not just creating random branches and, that's not going to be constructive. It's not going to communicate effectively. The brain has to, the cells will grow branches and then they have to meet up in a way that's effective and has a constructive outcome. And then some of them will get trimmed and disappear. And, all of this, it's a very, very complex and a process that requires a lot of calories. It's labor intensive. It's, so babies need to eat a lot and to sleep a lot. This happens while they sleep. When they sleep, they might look like they're chilling. Their brains are not chilling at all. Their brains are working in overdrive, creating new nerve cell dendrites so that they'll be able to get to the point where they'll, earlier on, they'll be able to smile. They'll be able to roll over. They'll be able to, et cetera, as these things develop. Part of the reason that there are, all of these milestones that at this many weeks a baby should do this and at this many weeks they should do that is because it takes that amount of time for the brain to form the connections necessary and then to learn to use those connections to create the hardware and then put the software in place. Now, this is true of controlling movement, etc. It's also true of learning. Right? When we learn information, you learn something, and tomorrow you can repeat the thing you learned today. That means that information is stored somewhere. Where is it stored? It's literally stored physically in our brains. If we knew how to map it out and how to really understand how this works, if a person learns information and yesterday they didn't know it, and today they do, yesterday that information wasn't in their brain, today it is in their brain, there's some sort of neurostructural change somewhere at a microscopic level, somewhere in their brain, which is the way that the brain physically stores that information. And you can see, again, it's much more limited, but you can demonstrate a degree of neuroplasticity in learning also. If you take at the right ages young students and, some of them are just learning following the regular schedule, and then you take a group that are really, really pushing the boundaries of their academic ability, of learning, of comprehension, of memory, really pushing all of those limits. If you were to do a super high resolution electron microscope scan of their brains before and after, over a large group, 2 large groups over a period of time, you would actually be able to see that the group that's been really pushing the limits academically is actually going to have grown new dendrites, new branches, so that their brains are capable of doing the extra processing, right? Which means that when we learn, it's not just this metaphysical or whatever we want to call it thing that the information stored in our brains, that's a physical phenomenon. Right, the same way that why is it that when a person lifts heavy weights, their muscles get stronger, they get bigger? Because the muscles generate the force. So if the body detects, I need to be able to generate more force in the future because I reached my limit today, so the body responds and says, well, if I need to generate more force, how is force generated? By muscles. If I want to generate more force, I need bigger muscles because the muscles physically generate the force. Same thing with the brain. The reason that the body will respond to having the academic limits pushed by creating new dendrites, new branches, new networking connections is because that learning is physically carried out by the nerve cells. It's a physical thing. The information is stored physically in the cells of the brain. And this is true of any kind of learning. When a child learns 1 + 1 = 2, that piece of information is physically stored in their brain. There is a neurochemical phenomenon that occurred, a change, which is, and by means of that change, the brain is storing that information. This is true for 1 + 1 = 2. It's also true for Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz. We learn a pasuk in Torah, we learn a halacha, we learn a mishnah, we learn a medrash, we learn some chassidus, whatever it is. When someone learns Torah, that information, the knowledge that they learned, is physically stored inside the nerve cells of their brains. It's a physical phenomenon, which is why the brain will actually physically adapt depending on age and exertion, etc., to accommodate more learning because it's physically stored. Now, both 1 + 1 = 2 and Bereshis bara Elokim are equally physically stored in the brain. What's very different about them is the fact that Bereshis bara Elokim is part of Torah. And the first word of the Aseret HaDibros is Anochi, I, which is a very unusual word. Ani is the usual Hebrew word for I. Why did it say Anochi? Anochi is an acronym for Anon Nafshi Ksavis Yahavis. Hashem says, I, Nafshi, my soul, my essence, Ksavis, have written Yahavis and placed inside the words of Torah. The information of Torah, whatever it means, literally contains Hashem inside of it. So when we learn 1 + 1 = 2, that piece of information is physically stored inside the cells of our brains. When we learn Bereshis bara Elokim, that piece of information is physically stored inside our brains. And what's inside that piece of information? Hashem himself. When we learn Torah, we are literally physically containing Hashem inside the cells of our bodies, of our brains, which is just an absurd thing to try and relate to and to think about. We are made up of a body and a soul, and this equivalent phenomenon is true of the soul. When we learn Torah, Torah is called the food of the soul. The soul, the neshama, gets nutrition from Torah. When we learn Torah, we're physically putting Torah inside our bodies. It's stored inside our brains, and it's a source of nutrition for our neshamas. Which is why the pasuk says, "Until in v'sorascha b'soich meri," and your Torah is in my innards, in my digestive system. It's a source of nutrition. So learning Torah, someone who's learned Torah, when we learn Torah, right? That's why it's always Torah mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs. Yes, learning Torah is a mitzvah, but there's something altogether different that happens when we learn Torah, which is we literally we physically contain the deepest and most profound form of divinity in our neurons and in our souls. So learning Torah is something that really develops the person. It adds to our souls. It develops who we are. So that's Torah. What's the primary ultimate? Well, there are obviously a number of layers to this, but what's the thing that mitzvahs do that's very different to this unique phenomenon that we discussed about Torah? When a person does a mitzvah, why is it that mitzvahs always require a degree of action? You have to do something. You can meditate from today to tomorrow about all the beautiful mystical things about lighting Shabbos candles. If you didn't light the candle, you didn't do the mitzvah. Someone doesn't know anything, mysticism, meaning nothing. All they know is you're Jewish, it's a mitzvah to light candles, and they say, I'm lighting candles to fulfill the mitzvah because I'm a Jew and this is a mitzvah. 100% mitzvah, right? Mitzvahs are physical. They generally include varying degrees of action, etc. And that's because the point of mitzvahs is to channel divinity into the world. A person lights Shabbos candles, the wick, the paraffin, oil, wax, whatever it was, both just became elevated and had divinity integrated into them because they were used for a mitzvah. The calories that the person used to move their hand to light the match were elevated. The food that they ate to get those calories and the money they used to buy the candles and the matches and the work they did to earn that money, all of these things now have become elevated. So the idea of mitzvahs generally is integrating divinity into the world, into the physical, mundane world and everything physical and mundane within it. Right? So we could sort of describe a difference, a thematic difference and categorical difference between Torah and mitzvahs, as Torah is focused, or the thing about Torah that's unique in addition to the fact that it's a mitzvah is that when we learn Torah, it really enhances the person, both the body by integrating divinity into the brain cells and the soul. Mitzvahs are primarily more about and oriented towards channeling divinity into the world around us, into the physical, mundane world, and everything physical and mundane about it. So Avraham had two things in which he was complete. Zaken, Zeh Shekana Chachma. Avraham had really achieved completeness in his mission, responsibility, and purpose as far as acquiring wisdom is concerned, as far as elevating himself, his soul, his brain, his nervous system, his body to the degree that is possible through acquiring wisdom, through bringing divinity into his brain and into his soul. He had acquired wisdom. And ba bayomim, he came into the days. He lived his life. He wasn't just focused on elevating himself and making himself complete. Ba bayomim, he was bringing this divinity into not just objects, into the days themselves, into time, into every aspect and layer of reality. And it's very common, and to a degree, it's inevitable, and it's supposed to be. It's not a bad thing. This is a feature, not a bug, right? We're all different. Different people have different personalities. There are some people who are, first of all, just enjoy and a lot more passionate about learning Torah than they are about mitzvahs. Right? And there are some people who are, in terms of their talents, they're more strongly predisposed to doing a better job and making a bigger contribution to Hashem and to the world and to the Jewish people and to the universe by focusing more on Torah study and maybe teaching, leadership, etc., rather than focusing on mitzvahs. Now, they have to do the mitzvahs, but it makes sense that there will be some people who focus more on Torah, and there are some people who's both, or could be either or both, a combination of which is ideal. Their interest and passion as a person, they're more drawn towards mitzvahs. They enjoy it more than they do learning. And maybe also their gifts and talents predispose them to effectively making a bigger contribution and achieving more through focusing more on Torah, on mitzvahs than on Torah. So you'll have some people who emphasize and focus on Torah more than mitzvahs, others who focus more on mitzvahs more than Torah. But we've all got to do, what we have to do in both. But the message here is to make sure that we don't focus on one at the expense of the other. Right, it's possible for a person to get carried away and say, oh my goodness, Torah, first of all, maybe I love learning Torah. Second of all, I learn Torah, and every word of Torah that I learn, I'm physically storing Hashem inside the nerves in my brain, which is just insane, and integrating Hashem into my soul, nourishing my soul. Somebody stop me. Can't stop. Won't stop. Learn Torah, mitzvahs, whatever. I'm developing myself here. I'm bringing Hashem into my brain, into my soul. I don't have time for other things. And then you might have someone who focuses on mitzvahs at the expense of Torah. Now, this is going to sound a little bit more selfless, a little bit more noble, but not necessarily is one more noble or selfless than the other, because they both can be and they can both not be. Anyways. But someone says, mitzvahs, I have to bring divinity into the world. I have to do mitzvahs. I have to help other people do mitzvahs, action. I have to learn Torah. I don't have time to learn Torah. I need to bring Hashem into the world. I'm going to focus on just bringing Hashem into myself. I'm going to bring Hashem into the world. Mitzvahs. And the lesson here in Avram is, those are both wrong. Hashem gave us the Torah, said, you have to learn Torah, you have to keep mitzvahs. We have to do both. Now, yes, it is reasonable and necessary, both in terms of people maximizing who they are and in terms of us as a society. Like with everything, we need to have different bases covered, and different people are, designed in terms of their body, their soul, their personality, their character to excel at different things. Yes, there are supposed to be people who focus more heavily on Torah than on mitzvahs, and people who focus more heavily on mitzvahs than on Torah. But to decide of our own accord, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to get carried away with one at the expense of doing what we need to do with the other, to focus so much on mitzvahs that we neglect learning Torah as much as we should be, or focusing so much on Torah that we neglect mitzvahs, we neglect being involved in mitzvahs to the degree that we should be, that becomes a problem. And so the Torah tells us Avram had really maxed out his capacity during his lifetime of acquiring wisdom, of integrating divinity into his brain, into his soul. It's fine, don't worry about it. Thank you. But he also had maxed out the capacity that was available during his lifetime, Bar Bayomim, to bring divinity into the days, into the world, into physical reality, into the mundane. He did both. And that's why the Medrash is not saying, well, you have some people who are only chronologically old, but they don't look old. And then you have some people who look old, but they're not chronologically old. But Avram, no. He had both. He was both old in age and he looked really old. Like, thank you. That's not the message that the Medrash is ultimately here to give us. The Medrash is telling us some people focus on acquiring wisdom at the expense of bringing divinity into the days, into the world, into nature, the way that they should be. And some people focus on mitzvahs, on channeling divinity into the world at the expense of learning Torah and elevating themselves, their brains, their souls, the way that they should be. So Avram did both. Avram is the forefather, the original patriarch of the Jewish people. And it makes sense that he's going to, for something as fundamental as this, or him and Sarah, we're going to come back to Sarah now and bring it full circle, that he's going to be the person, the two of them as a couple and as a team are going to be the people, the role models who teach us this idea. This is what we're here for. We're here to do both. Yes, sometimes maybe more one than the other, depending on the person, but it cannot be one at the expense of the other. We've got to be both. So with Avram, the way we see it is in the fact that the way that it's articulated is that he was complete both in terms of his acquiring, learning Torah and his mitzvahs. And about Sarah, we have the same idea. It says she was complete. Right? It doesn't say she was, it says, the Midrash says that Hashem knows about those who are complete. Hashem knows those who are complete, the days of those who are complete. Just like they're complete, so too their days, their years are complete. It doesn't say just like they are righteous, so too their years are righteous or complete. They are complete. Sarah lived her life in a way that Haim Tmimim, she herself was complete. She made sure to complete, to be complete, to make herself a complete person, i.e., to fulfill her responsibilities in, let's call it in, utilitarian terminology, self-development. She made sure to develop herself, to focus on Torah, on being the person she needed to be in terms of her own personal character and personality traits, qualities, characteristics. So she was complete. And also Yomeh HaTmimim, Shneiseh HaTmimim, her years were complete. Shana, years. Now, the word Shana, year, comes from the word Shinui, or is related to the word Shinui, which means change, right? Change necessarily, at least change as we know it, depends on time, right? Change means the way something is at one point in time is different to the way it was in a different point in time. So it makes sense. That's why the word Shana for year, which is one of the big units of time, is related to the word Shinui, change. Sarah didn't just, bring divinity into the world at the level of the things that are big, universal, consistent ideas and themes and things that are always the same. It was like, no, those little mundane things that change, they change from minute to minute, from hour to hour, second to second. Shnoiseha, her years, the time, the fabric of reality, at the level at which Shana, Shnoiseha, Shinoi, things are changing constantly, at the things that are mundane and might seem trivial, and they're so trivial that they can just change from one second to the next. Doesn't matter. If that's part of the world, it's part of what we are here to uplift and part of what we are here to channel divinity into. And this is why the Torah tells us this lesson specifically about Sarah. Just like, she was complete and her years were complete. Like Avram, Zoken, Babayomim, both of them achieved completeness in terms of their own personal development, becoming the person they needed to be, introducing divinity into themselves, learning Torah, storing Hashem in their brains, in their souls, becoming everything that they could be as an individual, and also Babayomim, coming into the days, Shnoiseha, Tmimim. The years were complete. The fabric of time was made complete to the degree that was possible during their lifetimes, even at the level of those things that are mundane and change from one second to the next. Avram and Sarah were the founders of the Jewish people, the original father and mother of all of us, and they are the ones who taught this. Now, there's another layer to this. Maybe we'll go for another, do it super briefly. This is related to the fact that the Torah, the Chazal say, it says in the Gemara, there's an expression, it says that there were 2 millennia. The first 2 millennia of the world were chaos, and the next 2 millennia, the third and fourth millennia, were a time of Torah. Now, the chaos early on we see pretty clearly, and so Chazal say that with Avram, Avram and Sarah in their lifetime and their journey is when the 2 millennia of Torah began. And this relates very much to what we see here in the lives of Avram and Sarah. What the millennia of Torah, more or less aligns very loosely, obviously, with Avram and Sarah being earlier, but it's generally correlated with and associated with the giving of Torah on Har Sinai. That's not the beginning of the time of Torah. Torah was learned before, but that was when the Torah was given to us. What changed? Before Hashem presented the Torah to us, Torah already existed. We could learn Torah, we could do mitzvahs, but the material and the spiritual and the divine, spirituality does not physically exist. Right? Angels are not physical beings. They're not made out of physical mass and energy. They're not made out of protons, electrons, and neutrons. They're not made out of atoms and molecules. They exist, they don't exist in a way that's any less real than that which is physical, but they're not physical. It's a different kind of reality. And the two don't mix. As far as the parameters that define physical reality, spirituality doesn't exist by the definition of those parameters. And as far as the parameters that define spiritual existence are concerned, physical reality doesn't exist. They're different realities defined by different parameters. They can't interact with each other. Until Hashem gave us the Torah, and Hashem says, Anochi, I am giving you the Torah. I, the creator of the physicality and spirituality, the creator of the parameters that define them differently and don't allow them to interact. I'm giving you the Torah. I'm giving you mitzvahs, and I'm giving these to you as a means by which you can now bring these two different things together. Now, when we learn Torah, we do mitzvahs, we channel divinity into the physical, into the material, into the mundane. That wasn't possible before, it was possible after. And this is why, and all of these things are coming together here. Avram and Sarah were the beginning of the age, let's call it the age of Torah. Right? We had the chaotic age and then the Torah age. They were the people the team that ushered in the age of Torah. What's the age of Torah? It's not just about the learning of Torah. It's about our ability to channel divinity into the world by means of Torah. That's the thing that changed at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And it makes perfect sense that they are going to be the people about whom the Torah tells us that they themselves were complete in their own development, Zokain, acquiring wisdom, integrating divinity into their bodies, minds, souls, and Kashem Shehem Tmimim, Sarah was complete herself as an individual, as a person, and also Shnoi Seha Tmimim, her years were complete. Ba Bayamim, Avram brought divinity into the days. It's both, because that's the whole point of the giving of the Torah. If we weren't here, if the point of existence wasn't to integrate divinity into the material, Hashem wouldn't have had to give us the Torah. First of all, Hashem wouldn't have had to create a world. Hashem wouldn't have had to give us the Torah. We were learning Torah before doing mitzvahs. Why do we have to have the drama on Har Sinai? The thing that changed was Hashem said, now you're doing it on my terms. Now you're not just doing your own thing. Now when you learn Torah mitzvahs, you can actually integrate divinity into the material, which is technically impossible. But as the creator of that which makes it impossible, Hashem can also give us the tools to override that. That's what the giving of the Torah is about. That's what the age of Torah is about. Avram and Sarah were the team that ushered in the age of Torah. They are the people who ushered in this age of us being able to integrate divinity both into our bodies, into our physical nervous systems, and into the world around us. And so this message is taught specifically about them. They ushered in the age of being able to integrate divinity into the world. And so the Torah tells us about them in that role, both of them. Sarah, Tamim, she was complete as a person in her development of herself and her work on herself and integrating divinity into herself. And Shnei Seha Tamimim, her years, her environment, the framework in which she existed also was made complete by the way she lived her life. And Avram, same thing. Zaken, he acquired wisdom of Torah. And Baba Yomim, he brought it into the days.